Hi, thank you for joining today's kickoff webinar to reflect on the Resilient by Design Bay Area Challenge and its 2-year anniversary. I am Allison Brooks. I'm Executive Director of the Bay Area Regional Collaborative, which you can learn more about if you go to barc.ca.gov. And I will also chair of the Resilient by Design Bay Area Challenge, as it was underway 2 years ago. Before we kick off, I want to acknowledge help from our partner, Amy Chester at Rebuild by Design, who I'm working with on this 2-year anniversary, and also Zoe Siegel, who is staff to the effort, who's now at Greenbelt Alliance, and Lucian Go, who's program coordinator at the Bay Area Regional Collaborative. So this was designed as a 6-part webinar series in lieu of being able to get together in person to celebrate, you know, the effort that we all experienced together. And the idea over the series is to really highlight all the work that's been underway around the region in communities around resiliency and adapting to climate change that resulted a lot from the Resilient by Design experience, and also progress on regional scale efforts related to climate adaptation and resiliency. And the idea behind this first webinar was really to highlight the role of design and design thinking in bringing together multiple issues that communities are dealing with, and whether it's now, and whether it's affordability and inequality and current issues, and also thinking to the future and the uncertain future we have before us, and the types of solutions we can develop together. And we conceptualized this a couple weeks ago, really, as we were dealing with the health pandemic and the crisis there, and thinking about the role of design in helping to address that issue now and into the future. And of course, here we are today, and I know we're all you know, challenged and experiencing the protest on, you know, we're experiencing on the streets, the mass protest in response to George Floyd's killing by police officers in Minneapolis. And we know that the many African-American men and women that have, you know, been experienced police brutality. And it really did make this current moment in time, has certainly made me, and I know others, we'll talk about it some today, reflect on the experiences that we had with Resilient by Design, the many important and challenging conversations we had talking about resiliency, talking about climate adaptation, and being pushed by community members in many Bay Area communities to really recognize that communities of color are dealing with a whole host of issues. And so it's important in the public sector, or the design community, or anybody working together with community on these issues, recognize that it's beyond a building, it's beyond a marsh or a seawall, but we're talking about all the many multitude of issues that we need to work on together, and recognize that our frontline communities deal with front and center on a daily basis. And it's our responsibility to come to the table and continue to have this dialogue. So that's really what this is an ongoing conversation. We experienced the incredible learning and partnership and network that was built during Resilient by Design. We want to continue that conversation and work together, because the only way we're going to work through the challenges that we're dealing with now in our communities is to actually work together, listen and learn from each other, and continue to work together to problem solve around these incredible challenges that we're all experiencing. So I think it's important to acknowledge that. And I really appreciate the designers that are participating in this conversation today, who were instrumental in some of the great and amazing concepts that came out of Resilient by Design, and many of which are moving forward. And so I'm going to hand it over to Cathy Simon, who's going to help moderate the conversation today.
Thank you, Allison. My goal is really to set the table for these 5 amazing designers who are going to speak to you. And we are, as designers, think about the physical world, but we also, I think, as Allison pointed out, think about the world of social issues, the world of equity, the world of climate change, all these things that we find ourselves facing today. And in the Bay Area, we are in a unique position and a very challenging position to really think about how to deal with that. And we have a beautiful, beautiful place here. And you can see from this aerial photograph, we are a combination of what I call the cultural landscape, the built landscape, and amazing nature. Next, please, Lucian. We have, this slide really shows it. We have the city, whether it's San Francisco or Oakland or San Leandro or San Jose or any city in the North Bay. And we have an incredible natural world. And the two coming together is how I think we as designers can really position ourselves to help imagine and actually create a new kind of future for this wonderful region. Next, please. We have amazing access to nature. And, you know, one of my hopes is that some of the slowdown that we've experienced with COVID could actually be a teaching moment for us in how to live in a better way with the natural world. Next, please. Design can make places for nature, but it also can make places for people. And this is Chrissy Field, as some of you know, this is a park that was designed by, among others, Kevin Conger, who will be speaking to you later, but it's a way of making common ground for people. And design has the power to take something that was a really beat up place and make it into something that's wonderful and that's used, next please, by many, many people in the community. So one of the ways we can do this is by creating really accessible, equitable open space, which combines nature and culture together. Next, please. We can also think about buildings, as we do as architects, some of us. We think very strongly about how through our work in buildings or making new buildings or repurposing older buildings can create common ground for community. Next. I'm Claire Weisz.
Great. Thanks, Cathy, for, as an architect, setting up another architect to reflect on 2 years ago. And again, I really want to thank Allison, Amy Chester, all of the staff at kind of setting up this series of discussions so that we can kind of explain, in a way, our reflection. So I thought Christopher Alexander was right on here, and it's also an excuse to have the eminent Bay Area urbanist and architect talk. But I think a lot of people assumed that Resilient by Design was about master planning, that somehow we were all going to come up with a big plan, and that plan would answer all questions and solve all things. And so I think it's interesting to reflect why it was a good idea not to have that. And I think this quote about how, and so apt today as we look at what the meaning of order is and control and planning, about the beauty of thinking about how things can happen organically, that we can adapt to natural and unpredictable changes. And we're in that time. Next slide. So I, in a lot of ways, we came into this as, at the time, a New York-based firm that had been able to work with the community on the right-hand side, the East River Blueway, that turned into another rebuild project that is along the Lower East Side, that's looking at primarily flooding and sea level rise, to kind of looking at whether there was larger visions of how energy, nature could actually help people adapt to a future 100 years from now in New York and the Bay called Blue Dunes, to something very tangible, which was working with communities on rebuilding a destroyed boardwalk. So next slide. When we kind of got together as the Bionic team and ended up in the second part of rebuild, focusing on a particular place, which is San Rafael, I couldn't help but reflect on the fact that it really is these specific communities, and those communities that are essentially the front lines, the essential workers, the ones that have been suffering most from rising real estate prices, from lack of housing security, from basically jobs that require long commutes, and from a housing market that's so tight that we looked at places they were living in all over the Bay Area. And there was very little, in a sense, appetite to talk about housing as part of Rebuild by Design. And I think for a lot of us coming from other places in the country, that was really disappointing, that in fact it wasn't primarily focused on basically how to create more room for nature by having more housing security for people and safer places. And I think we tried to figure out ways to have a kind of learnings around that, but also to learn from the community about how important places like this community center was. So if you go to the next slide, about sort of combining a bridge, and now it turns out it's COVID, or it was the fires while we were doing this. It's not always the disaster that we think it's going to be, you know. It may not be the relentless storm. It may actually be a kind of someone's immune system that's the storm is happening in. So I think that that idea of not a process that just doesn't solve one problem, but creates a process of dialogue is really important. So I wanted to just reflect in the last slide on what we didn't talk about on Rebuild. So Rebuild, I think, was organized really well because there was a first part where all the teams were in research mode and they looked at the whole bay. So coming out of that, and you can see our slide, Bionic slide to the left, where we started really being intrigued by two communities that were joined by a bridge, and a bridge that in our estimations, you can tell below, could be a lot more things than what it is today. It could be a lifeline, it could be for bikes, it could actually be for nature, it could, and that was considered, I think, a bridge too far. But when I reflect on it now, it's really those issues of continuity, whether it's Allison Sant, Studio for Urban Projects, who was part of our team organizing bike site visits, or in the end, if it isn't really taking on the big infrastructure projects. But in light of what's been going on in the country for years, and there was one elephant in the room, one community we didn't talk to, and that was San Quentin. So we think about these two communities, and there's a community that's not even on our map here that I think we all, when we think about resiliency and adaptation, we really have to include restorative thinking for everyone and on every level. And now I'm passing it off to the next slide, staying within my 4 minutes.
Thanks, Claire. Josiah Cain here with Sherwood Design Engineers. I can resonate with a lot of that around, you know, a great big master plan. And is there a point at which the vision is so large that you can't build a bridge between the process we're in and the current trajectory and this larger vision? And you know, that's interesting in the current climate for sure. Going to the next slide. Our first big concept, this is the area we're looking at. It's interesting because as it happens, we have Dogpatch on the right here to the north and Bayview to the left. 2 of the 4 hardest hit neighborhoods for coronavirus. And also all 4 neighborhoods, if you include Potrero Hill and the Mission, and Soma, those are kind of the top 5 neighborhoods, and none of them really have open space, and they all have justice issues in one form or another. And we see that emerging with coronavirus. A big part of this project was trying to resolve some of those things. We started out with the idea of a social ecosystem. Moving ahead, looking at natural systems and urban systems and trying to understand how they're not necessarily oppositional, but how they can be integrated into one functional system. Moving forward, and really looking at how sort of climate stresses and urban stresses are not necessarily independent either, right? So looking at things like sea level rise and groundwater and seismic hazards, also looking at things like displacement and accessibility. And so we were really grappling with, how to really address these physical issues that are occurring on the waterfront in the context of other social issues that are happening there. And, I think that we were thinking more in terms of protecting the social infrastructure that's there, but we certainly didn't imagine something like what we have now. Move to the next slide. So our fundamental process was looking at protecting that physical edge. In this case, very much a sea level rise issue, although also some upstream flooding and infrastructure issues that are there. Restoring the environment, which is a really big deal. Isthmus Creek, the largest watershed in San Francisco. It's almost completely underground at this point and very industrial. So trying to restore that clean environment, connect the people, the sources and the flows. It's a very big logistics area. Also historically housed and employed actually very large African-American community around the Navy essentially and the shipyard, and then longshoremen, and that's gradually declined over time. Trying to reconnect the people, the housing, the economics, et cetera, and then grow that identity so that the community that does lift up is the same community that's there now. Moving on. And so we really found ourselves in this idea of a social ecosystem, looking at a very large group of people, trying to understand how they all connect. And I think to a great extent, we were very successful in connecting people to a city that they hadn't really spoken to or trusted in perhaps decades, and building sort of a collaborative stance in the neighborhood. I think we overly focused on a huge vision and also on a very sort of physical response. And I guess I'm left with sort of how to best move things in the short term toward this big vision, and not because everything happens, one step at a time. The existing process sort of being on a slightly different trajectory and not being able to realize this. But then also just really thinking about that social fabric and that social infrastructure. It's not a coincidence that these communities that are already hardest hit by these physical threats are also hardest hit by the pandemic, which is, I guess, also a physical threat. And then beyond that, some of the obvious tensions around social and racial equity that are happening as well right now. So there's been a lot to think about as far as how this plan may or may not address some of those things we weren't thinking about. But I do feel like if there were a big open space there, that may actually be helpful. And maybe I have one more slide, but I think I'm about done. Yeah, just looking at the various communities that we worked with. Keep going. And that's it.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Kevin Conger from CMG Landscape Architecture, and CMG was one member of a really big team called the All Bay Collective, which worked on the Estuary Commons project in East Oakland. Next slide, please. And I'm going to talk a little bit about our project at Estuary Commons, but I'm going to mostly try and reiterate some of the points that others have made about the overall takeaways from the RBD challenge and the lessons learned, and how I'm hopeful that those are informing new work and future work around the Bay Area. And some of the really big takeaways for me were, first of all, that this was a design-driven challenge, that the idea that design be in the forefront, I thought was really critical. Secondly, that it was regional across the entire Bay and not just area by area. And thirdly, that it was comprehensive in the scope of issues, as has been mentioned by a few of the speakers, and particularly around social vulnerabilities, which included issues of income, access to education, health and safety, and really was more than just physical design or flood protection. Next slide. So quickly, this is the site that our team focused on. This is called the Estuary, and it is, in fact, a community that is diverse and complicated and is affected by a lot of those issues of vulnerability that I just mentioned in the previous slide. There's a lot of infrastructure there. The airport is right there. There's some communities that have been really that are vulnerable and have had limited access to education, food safety, all of those critical things. Next slide. The plan that the team looked into was attempting to be fully comprehensive. Of course, it included affordable housing. Of course, it included open space for nature and health and recreation and people's enjoyment. It looked in a big way at mobility and infrastructure, and importantly, tried to advance a set of community planning tools that would empower the community itself to be more in charge of the future of this part of the Bay Area. Next image. It included, of course, nature-based solutions that improved the ecology and nature in the Bay and gave people access to the Bay. Next image. And I think in some of the more interesting ways, tackled the issues of governance and funding as a way to empower the local community, to put them more in charge of the decisions and the changes that were to happen within their community around housing, jobs, around education, food, all of those things, and had some interesting ideas around resilient equity hubs, which were sort of a community benefit district idea or some version of that, which I thought has a lot of potential actually in moving forward. And next slide. And also tackled some of the big challenges with the way that infrastructure is dividing this community and particularly separating it from the Bay and from nature. And I just want to point, and this is showing a rebuilding of the 880 to put that underground and create a new transit hub there that stitches the community back towards the Bay. And I really just want to acknowledge that this idea and the idea of the previous slide, these are really, really complicated and really, really challenging and not something that can be solved in a short design challenge, but I think really important to get on the table and to get a conversation going around these issues. Next slide. And I wanted to kind of give a shout out to the Common Ground team, which is not really included in today's presentation. Hopefully they'll be in some of the other seminars, but I want to get to the point of the role of design in dealing with these issues and the ability for designers to help visualize and inspire a better future. And this was one of the favorite images for me and most beautiful images that I think came out of the whole RBD challenge, and I think really illustrates how the power of visualization is really a tool that designers can bring to this conversation. Next image. I want to just talk quickly about moving forward and introduce another project that I'm involved in. with Cathy actually and the Port of San Francisco, which is the San Francisco Waterfront Resilience Program, which is looking at a 100-year time horizon for the 7.5 miles that are under the port jurisdiction, and has a mission of creating a self-equitable, sustainable, and inspiring waterfront. And is really, I think, learning a lot from the RBD Challenge experience. Lindy Lowe is the urban design project manager for the port on this, and she was very much involved in the RBD Challenge project. And if you go to the next slide, I just want to talk briefly about a couple things. One is that we're really taking seriously this idea of empowering communities and engaging communities early in a way that we talk to people about what is important to them and what matters to them and what their priorities are, and attempting to really put them in the driver's seat about what should be the long-term future of these communities and all the different neighborhoods around the waterfront. And then the next slide, these are some very preliminary renderings of the plan, but also again trying to use this idea of design as a way to visualize and inspire and help move ideas forward and motivate everybody involved to kind of work towards a better future. Thank you. Next speaker.
There we go. Hi, Marcel Wilson, Design Director at Bionic. And our office was fortunate enough to lead a team during Resilient by Design in collaboration with WXY and Claire Weisz, as well as Penn Design and several other firms who all played a big part in our main question, which was in the face of so many stressors today in the Bay Area, who needs help first? And we arrived at the conclusion through a pretty deep analysis that it was San Rafael, and our team came around to a position of trying to suggest how an entire city could reposition itself in the Bay Area, not as a sleepy hamlet, but as a city that's part of the critical infrastructure of the Bay Area and its economy. Next. San Rafael had very deep structural problems, and our team proposed a variety of catalyst and pilot projects that could correct those problems over time, transform a large area at the scale of a city, and lift everyone up. To elevate San Rafael was I think our philosophical and design objective. And so there are a range of pilot projects in there to transform it over time. Next slide. One of those was probably the place that is most important to a community that has been discriminated against and disenfranchised for a long time. That's the canal community, and this is Pickleweed Park. And the idea with Pickleweed Park was that it could be a resilience hub for day-to-day needs and to build the community and its sort of social infrastructure and connectivity. Next slide. But also as a place that could serve that community very precisely in times of stress. So that they may sustain a shock and remain there. And so that was one of several projects. And I don't think anybody in our team or other teams thought that we were going to leave Resilient by Design and people were going to go out and build those projects. If you fast forward to today, next slide, Marin County is a place where there's sort of decades of racism and social issues embedded in the culture there. The issues of today, COVID-19, and the things we see on the news, those are just exacerbated and accentuated by COVID, even in Marin County. What has changed over that time? The canal district was dedicated as an opportunity zone in the Trump tax bill. That's created additional stresses, evictions, rent hikes to people who really are most in need and play a vital role in the county and in the region. Today, because of COVID, the Marin County Food Bank is oversubscribed. They're seeing types of need that they'd never seen before. And there's stories of Pickleweed Park functioning as the community center and that kind of and to form social cohesion that we knew it performed, but they're just now more acute. One of my favorite sort of anecdotes is that families are pulling up to the community center and they're kind of blasting Wi-Fi out into the parking lot so that kids can have access to Wi-Fi to continue their education. So I'd say if reflecting back on Resilient by Design, I think generally our team got it right about San Rafael as a place and how it needs to become and how it needs to find a way to transform, about the place that most acutely affected people, Pickleweed Park, and how that project's still valid. And so when we ask ourselves, what is the role of design now? There's a big push, I think, everywhere to kind of go back to normal. And I'd maintain that there's a large contingency of people that don't want to go back to normal. They want something different, and you can see that on the news. I'm sure that there are lots of examples of that. But going back to normal is actually not where we need to go. I think the role of design is actually to show where we can go. Right now, more than ever, there's probably not money to do the big things, but there is the body of evidence and work that all the projects from Resilient by Design created that can demonstrate where we should go as a society and a region. And I would just end by saying, the designers are still here. We're still the ones that hold these ideas and can still, promote them and advance them in our sort of collective conversation about the future. Veronica.
Thank you, Marcel. Hi, everyone. I'm Veronica Rivera with James Corner Field Operations, and we led the field operations team. We proposed, as part of the RBD effort, the South Bay Sponge. Next. And in that effort, we basically went back to the origins, right? The most resilient of all infrastructures, which is nature itself, and understanding nature as a sponge that could address stormwater runoff as well as sea level rise. Next. And we're fortunate in the Bay to have a lot of this, but obviously there's a need for more. Next. And as part of the effort, we looked at over 30 miles of the South Bay, and with a series of swaps and kind of restructuring of urban and natural systems, created an armature that, even though we applied it in the South Bay, can kind of be applied anywhere in the Bay Area, because the challenge was to kind of address the genesis of the issue and not necessarily see it as a formal exercise, but a kit of parts that could be applied everywhere. Next. And the essence, or the kind of conclusion of the process, I think, was the possibility of taking pieces that are known and rethinking them and restructuring them, questioning the existing zoning, the existing traditions of how to build the environment, and reorganizing that space to provide more space for nature, because it's needed, right? And it is the most efficient of all systems. Next. So we did look at the full South Bay, and I think when questioned what is design, what's the capacity of design under these circumstances, I think being able to visualize these systems and bridge the gap for the different agencies and the different groups that are all doing great things in the Bay Area, to understand that the solutions don't need to be just engineering focused or just ecological, but that through design you can overlap these systems and make frameworks that are much richer and diverse and strong, right? They're stronger than the individual pieces of an armature. Next. But as part of our effort, I think the biggest impact or where we learned the most wasn't necessarily the design of it, but more the communication and how to engage the communities that were affected, kind of simplifying these complex issues into something that they could just much more palpable and straightforward, and just that they could get quickly. Next. So we took the idea of the sponge and put it a bit on steroids and use it as a communication and engagement strategy. And we kind of wrap this little mini hub to take all around the South Bay. Next. And this provided us the opportunity to really use the RBD effort as an education process. We were surprised of how much interest the community had in learning about resiliency, not understanding that how vulnerable their communities were, and their kind of desire and thirst to learn more, to understand more. And right now, we on a separate project, not RBD related, we continue to work in the East Palo Alto community, and it's amazing to see how the narrative has changed. Where 2 years ago, they would come to us asking, what is resiliency? What are you talking about? Where is this sea level rise going to occur? And now it's coming the other way around, where they're questioning us, how is your project going to address sea level rise and climate change? So it's interesting to see that transformation in the community in such a short period of time. Next. So combining all of these systems, right? Obviously, there is opportunity to create amazing places, resilient places, places that deal with stormwater, places that deal with sea level rise, but also places for people. I think during this Corona situation, we've learned, or not, we shouldn't have learned, but it's kind of re-emphasized the fact that we are part of nature. That the same way that nature needs more space to be resilient, people need space to be resilient, and open space allows for that to happen. So I think through design, we can combine these systems to really make places for people. Next. And ultimately, I think for all of us, that's the most important. These images are right here by my house in Lake Merritt during the Corona, and it's proof that it's open space, it's space for it's nature that allows communities to come outside, to take a breather, to find health. So for me, the resiliency challenge and how design deals with resiliency, it's not just about sea level rise or nature, but it's also about people, and how can we use these spaces to make communities more resilient. Next. And open space is the place where everyone's welcome, right? It doesn't matter who you are, where you come from, your social group, your income. And this is a proof, right, that these spaces allow for that. And this is just a small sample of field operations projects all over the world: Hong Kong, Cleveland, here in California, down in Santa Monica, where the open spaces that might have been designed for recreation or just have transformed into the centers for protest, the centers where everyone feels welcome to come and speak up. So to me, that's also a critical part of resiliency, and something that through design we have the capacity to achieve when we are able to combine and bridge the gap of this multiplicity of systems. Next. So again, this is kind of a full picture, but as you can see, it's more than the sum of its parts, and I think visualization and design allows us to bridge the gap, to create a common vision where different agencies, different communities, different perspectives, people with different priorities can come together to envision a future that can address a multiplicity of complexities. And that's it. Thank you.
Well, I thought those were incredible conversations that everybody proposed, and I really appreciate everybody's perspective. One thing, since this is about design, this is really the first kickoff of these webinars, and I just wanted to point out that something that Veronica said too that is really important, that design is a way of visualizing something. It brings things together. It's the capacity to imagine a better future. And I agree with Marcel. I mean, we don't want to go back to where we were. We want to go somewhere else. And we can, as designers, help communities envision that, but only if we listen. So actually, I thought to just kick off from Veronica's comments, going to Josiah, because one point you made, Josiah, was that the open space is very, very little in those neighborhoods, Dogpatch and Bayview, Potrero Hill, Mission, and Soma. And I wondered if you could talk about that a little bit, Josiah, as a really from an engineering and design perspective. Josiah?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think there's, you know, several layers. Certainly one is green infrastructure, which we focus on a lot, and the ability to manage water, whether it be flooding or sea level rise. So certainly from a technical standpoint, you know, infrastructure needs space. But it seems like, you know, I think we're also seeing, you know, with the pandemic, that if people are forced close together and don't have space to get outside in a situation like we're in, I think it's much harder to control. I mean, I don't know the science behind why these communities that don't have open space have higher infection rates, but I think that's probably a contributor. I think that there are several reasons. And I also wonder how much it contributes to stress. I mean, just mental health and stress factors at a time like this when we're, you know, confined to home. You know, if you live in Point Reyes and you can walk to a national seashore, you're allowed to do that, but you're not allowed to drive there and park there from somewhere else. So if you live in a neighborhood with no open space and you're only allowed to go to open space you can walk to, a time like this really just enhances that dramatically, right? And I think that contributes to all kinds of magnification of inequity of access.
Well, I think that's a really, really great point. And I think we as designers need to make the case for open space and for even small open spaces. Claire, one of the things that I thought was interesting about your talk was the idea of restorative justice and the connection to the San Quentin community. And I believe there even was a question that might have come up from one person in the audience. I guess the question is, why didn't you connect with them, and how could we think about them as being part of the San Rafael community? Because what Kevin pointed out is that in the ABC All Bay Collective, we have Alameda, East Oakland, and the airport. Mm-hmm. That's three really diverse communities. In San Rafael, you have a pretty wealthy group who live there. You have the Canal community, and then you have San Quentin. And how can we think about bringing those groups together better? Claire?
Well, Cathy, I think that's a project right there. And we should all that was in a way the project we were trying to set up, which is, going back to what Josiah was trying to answer about science. I think one of the opportunities of Rebuild was this real dialogue between disciplines. And there's been I think it came out today or yesterday, there's some very detailed, and because of COVID, all of a sudden there's some real detailed data about how our cities are actually impacting the health of residents. And in particular, and this is something I remember, Marcel, we really focused on, which was in the bands of highways that were full of particulates that were impacting the air quality. And when you, especially as traffic increases, those communities that are below the fall of all of these freeways are impacted directly. And those are the communities whose numbers that are basically hospitalizations from the virus, in particular deaths, are higher when we have worse air pollution. So it's so clear that we have infrastructure, highways, we have communities that are detained, like San Quentin. We have communities that can't move also because of housing costs. And those three, the idea of having an opportunity instead of opportunities only being empty land, but instead opportunities are those people and community. In other words, the development opportunity is the communities you have versus the development opportunity only being about site, I think is a really important, actually, model shift that we could all have. And I think that's something that really came up in a lot of the projects, which is the value is the communities. The value isn't, and the place for them, the value isn't just how many, what kind of a site they have.
Kevin, I wondered if you might talk a little bit about thinking about a comment you made of the ABC or All Bay Collective group, the sites you had infrastructure, and this we found in almost every single site, infrastructure as a dividing barrier, not only a cause of environmental pollution and so on, but also an environmental barrier, as we saw in Marin City. But thinking about that, can you hear me? Oh God.
I can't hear you.
I'm sorry. Kevin, why don't you just take it from there?
Okay, that was a non-question. I'm sorry, I have a little background noises. Am I audible or?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Look, I think
sorry.
These issues of infrastructure and the agencies that actually have governance of these jurisdiction of the infrastructure makes it really, really complicated for communities to have a lot of actual power and say in how these things can change. And that's really the hardest part of this, I think. I mean, to be able to move or change or somehow redesign these freeways and massive transit corridors to where they have a better relationship to impoverished and disempowered communities is so hard. And it really is just really at the heart of how inequity is truly designed into our communities. And I totally agree with Claire, is that the value here and the place for investment is in the community, not in the real estate, not in the assets, not in the other physical things. It's in the people and the communities. And that's still not to say that things are easy to fix. Imagine how long it would take to actually implement change on something like changing a freeway or moving a freeway, but we have to do it. We just have to. I just really believe we just have to begin there. And as Claire said, I think we really need to invest in the community as the most valuable research. That's really the most valuable thing that we actually have is the people that are here in our communities. And what's so sad is how divided we apparently are. If you look at a broader geographical area across the country, and the apparent lack of empathy for one another's conditions. And it's something that just seems, it's really depressing. And we see it right now in the goings-ons that are happening across the country right now. And it's, it seems impossible to overcome actually, but we're all here, we have to do that. We just have to get to work on that issue.
Marcel, I think I just want to make sure everybody gets a chance to say something. You actually were very provocative, I thought, when you said the role of design is not necessarily to get back to normal. I think the role of design is, I agree with you totally. But can we think about together, and as this series of these 6 conversations, think about what that new normal might be. And certainly in the projects that you guys have all proposed, you were doing that. But could you further comment on that at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good time for design to take the disruptor role and to do that with the main agency that we have, which is creativity. We have faculties and ways of thinking, and I would say modes of working where, you know, creativity is you know, I think it's kind of our greatest resource at this point. I think one thing you're going to see, and we all want to do big things. Everybody wants big things done, and what we're going to hear from agencies and cities and electeds is we can't do anything. We don't have enough money. Our tax base is falling out. You know, there's a million reasons why, and so I think you know, creativity is something that can pry at that, and we can use what we know how to do to show people a different direction. I think the other thing that RBD did, and Resilient by Design, that is, and they did a good job of it, was they kind of made a playbook for all of the, basically the kind of fast and cheap ways that you can motivate and organize people. And I think that's a pretty good resource for now, to shift for designers in general to be, to think of their ability to be more tactical and disruptive through creativity.
Okay, I'm going to actually stop you there because there are some questions from the audience. I thought that was a great answer. And Lucian has some questions for us.
Thanks. Yeah. So thanks to all of you who submitted questions. This first question, I think, is pretty relevant to our current moment. An anonymous attendee asks, what are the ways that climate adaptation and design professionals can dismantle racism and white supremacy with their projects, and as contributors to the very field that institutionalized redlining and contributed to structurally racist policies within city making?
Who would like to answer that one? How about Veronica? You were the
So I think it's already started in the sense that, as many have mentioned this call, the power of design and decision making is being transferred again to the community. Not again, probably for the first time, and to the communities, and having designs that respond to them and are coordinated with them is becoming ever more critical. I think that it's a deep-rooted issue, and it has to be tackled by everyone on all fronts if we can ever get somewhere. But situations like the one we're living right now has only kind of heightened the need, right, for spaces that are inclusive and have brought light to the issues of the ripple effect of implications, right? I think now people are understanding that if you have a sector of the population that is unhealthy, we're all unhealthy. And if you have a sector of the population that is being brutalized, we're all being brutalized. No one can have peace if we don't have the right to it. And that goes from open space to be able to take a walk and have a breather and have health, to social justice. Like it's applicable in all topics.
I thought that was a great answer. Do you have another question, Lucian?
Sure, yeah. So in addressing the coronavirus crisis, Jeanette Kim asks, what public decision-making processes do you anticipate emerging in response to the COVID-19 crisis? For example, regarding health needs, job loss, public space, etc. Where do you see those overlapping with or departing from public empowerment opportunities identified by the teams in RBD?
I'm going to give this one to Kevin because you actually talked about governance quite a bit and funding.
I don't know if I can answer the question directly.
I don't know if anybody really.
But I think this issue, and it's sort of related to the question that Veronica answered for the previous question. We just need to get more of the community needs to be better represented at the table for making the decisions. That's really what it comes down to. And one way to do it is by having a different type of process, decision-making process, that involves a broader conversation with the community in a way that the community is empowered. The other way to do it is to transform all of the professions, the professionals that are at the table making these decisions, from landscape architects and urban designers like ourselves to policymakers that are working for the cities to, you know, people that work in all levels of government and in the private sector. We need to do all of those things. And so there's no like flip the switch answer to this. You know, I really think that it's it just runs so deep that it's going to take a while, and that's not an excuse to say I can't do anything about it, because I can, and we all need to say that we all have to do something. We all have to do everything we can to kind of move this thing forward. And so when it comes to COVID, it's about access to health. It's about access to open space. It's about the ability to get outside, as Josiah was saying, so you don't go crazy and you're so confined. It's about all of these things. And there's no like simple thing, I don't think, that any of us can do right now to solve this.
I think it's interesting that one of the really great features of Resilient by Design was that it actually brought those groups together. It brought people who are in the government, it brought communities, it brought engineers of transportation, it brought water people. I mean, it was a very integrative thing. It could be a great example for how to think about this in the future.
Yeah, and, you know, I'll say one thing about the RBD process in a slightly critical way is that, you know, it started actually in a way ahead of the communities. It needed to, because it had a really short time frame for what it was trying to do. And so it did that, and was sort of, I guess, imperfect in that way. But I would really hope that the next step would be now the communities coming back to sort of say what they want. What did they get out of that? Where do they want to go with these things? And what are they talking about? And you know, I don't know about the rest of you all who participated in this, but sadly for myself, I'm not as engaged with that community and those issues anymore. You know, that project sort of ended, and we're busy working on other things, and it's been difficult to stay involved and engaged and in touch in a way that I was hoping we could be helpful with those communities to follow their leads and help them get where they want to go. I don't know if anyone else has a different experience.
I just thought it was worth adding something that I think we're really learning out of the events over the last 4 days is that as designers, architects, planners, landscape architects, listening to Black landscape architects, Black architects, NOMA, other people about that we have a community also and a lot of resources and a lot of talents there that I think that who really are looking for more opportunities. And at the same time, I think communities are looking for more opportunities. So sometimes things are about money, but I think they're also about having younger, you know, we have a huge number of more women and more minority architects and landscape architects than ever about to graduate into an economy that seems to have little opportunity. And I keep looking at whether there's hundreds of Pickleweed Parks and there's all these things, how the terrain that we all set up could be actually an amazing moment for the whole next generation of designers.
And I just want to point out.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I just want to point out that our future webinars, we have 5 more webinars coming up, are going to address this topic as well. So please stay tuned for those.
I just think that one of the things that Claire just said is really important, that these people emerging from schools and young people are not completely discouraged by this, by the job market, by their future. We want the future for these young people to be really bright, and for everybody, honestly. But I think design can help. I believe that it really has the power to make changes, to be disruptive, but also to be disruptive for the very, very public good. And that's why we're all here. You have one more question?
Sure. So Richard Mullane asks, there's been a lot written lately about public space, open public space and racism, some opinions that challenge the traditional open space is for everyone narrative that we as designers have come to expect. sorry. I'm wondering how the panelists feel about this and how design might tackle this challenge head on. And we only have about less than a minute left, so if we can quickly answer this one. And
Veronica,
anybody, it's really open to anyone. Yeah.
Well, maybe I am an idealist, because I generally do believe that open space is the canvas where everyone is welcome, right? And when it comes to responding to an example I'll give is Cleveland Public Square. We rebuilt the center of the city, and within a day, there was members of all ages and all races playing together in the water feature. And I think that might be the genesis of more tolerance and understanding, and realizing that we're all just human, is when you engage and you play with and you interact with people that are different from you. It helps to fade away the ignorance of difference, right? Or the fear of difference, and to embrace it. We're not all the same. It's okay not to be all the same. But when you have the opportunity to get to know people from other cultures, from other places, from other ethnicities, you learn from them, you embrace them, you care about them. And I think it is a way, exposing people of all ages to each other is a way to help in the equation. It's a complex issue, but I am an idealist. I do believe that if it's really hard for someone to grow up to be a racist if they play in the same playground as a child, you know, and that's a starting point.
It's all about common ground. And speaking of that, we're at 1 o'clock already, and I think it's been a wonderful event to engage with all of you. All of you are friends of mine and friends of this wonderful challenge that Allison and Amy and others put forward. And I look forward to people, you guys and the audience engaging in the next 5 of these meetings. And, you know, after that, I think we can figure out what to do next. There's got to be something. Anyway, thank you all very much. Stay tuned next Tuesday at noon. We all look forward to being there with you. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.